Thank you all so much for being here today. I'm really excited to have our first of our Happy Hour from Home series with Jameson Watts, who's our program chair. Jameson is an assistant professor of marketing and data science, as well as a program chair, as I said, for computational data and information sciences at Willamette. Prior to earning his PhD, Jameson worked in software and digital marketing, leading the development of a variety of early stage technology ventures. Some of these ventures were later acquired by Shutterfly, Jive, and Oracle. His research is focused primarily on natural language processing and using the text from online reviews and product descriptions to uncover marketing insights. He has published in several top-tier journals, including Network Science, the Journal of Interactive Marketing, and the Journal of Business Research. And when he's not teaching and doing research, Jameson enjoys surfing in the frigid waters off the Oregon coast. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jameson Watts.
Hi all. Oh, thanks. Like the virtual kind of waves and claps are kind of be what we have to deal with, I suppose, these days. But I will take the applause when I can get it, when and where I can get it. So I kind of want to keep this casual if we can. I know it's awkward to be casual in these online environments, but to the extent possible, let's keep it conversational. And so raise your hand, write in the chat. I'll try to call on you if you have questions as I go through the presentation. If you feel more comfortable just throwing it in the chat, Lizzie is going to be monitoring that, and she'll bug me to stop my presentation and answer questions as we go along. And so without further ado, I will jump right into the presentation. And again, feel free to interrupt me at any time as we go along. Okay, let's see. I think that'll work. How's it look, Lizzie?
Looks great to me.
Okay. So let's see. I just want to make sure I get all of your lovely faces on my other screen before I go. Zach, nice work drinking wine. I appreciate it. Cheers, buddy. All right. So I'm going to give a bit of a talk on what makes Oregon wine unique. But I am the program chair in data science here at Willamette, and so forgive me, I'm going to give you a short pitch on some of our programs before we get into it. I promise I won't take too long before jumping into the fun content. But my boss would fire me if I didn't at least throw out some information about what we're doing here at Willamette. And so data science at Willamette, this is a relatively new thing we're doing, but it's amazing. I'm super excited about some of the work that all of the professors have done with me to make this happen. And so first of all, I wanted to explain what the heck a data scientist is, because not many people actually understand it. And that actually goes for data scientists too. So even within the industry, folks don't necessarily know what this profession is. And so here's a definition that I feel comfortable with. It's someone who has a bit of programming knowledge, they can manage some data, and crucially, they can derive insights from that data. And so I think this is perhaps a reasonable definition. A more tongue-in-cheek definition that folks pass around is a mediocre programmer paired with a mediocre statistician. Somehow that combination ends up as an amazing individual who is very marketable in the marketplace. Here's another way of looking at it. You've got kind of the computer science component, which deals with automating processes and somewhat with managing data. You've got the statistics component, which has to do with running models designing experiments, etc., learning how to derive insights. But crucially, you have to have some deep domain knowledge in a context. And that context might be something like business or marketing, which is my area of specialty. But it could also be in, the migration patterns of salmon in the Columbia River and how, seal activity affects those patterns, right? And so some context and deep domain expertise paired with a bit of computer science and a bit of statistics kind of makes the perfect Venn diagram of what a data scientist ends up being in the real world. Why should you think about data science as a career? It's generally contains really happy employees. Folks are paid well, they report being happy in their profession, and there's a ton of job openings, not just in nationwide, but also in the Portland area. I regularly reach out to business professionals in the area, and they are always looking for folks with these sorts of skills. So what are we doing? We've got a couple of programs. We have a bachelor's program, of course, but the master's degree is starting this fall. It is a 12-month master's degree, which is 3 semesters, fall, spring, and summer, with 3 courses each in each of those semesters. And so you can actually complete the master's in 12 months and then move on to your awesome job. Details, courses are weeknights in the Portland Center, so they're compatible with working professionals. We cover dinner and course materials, and merit scholarships, automatic discount for Willamette alumni, et cetera, et cetera. Mostly look on the website or just email me or call me directly. Lizzie can send you my contact info after this, and I'm happy to talk with you about these sorts of programs. Okay, so if you have questions, I'll hang around after the presentation, and we can chat casually. You may have to let me go get my glass of wine and then come back, but at that point, I'm happy to sit and hang out with folks and talk about whatever it is you want to talk about. Okay. So I promise that wasn't too long, right? We can get on to the good stuff. All right, here we go. So what makes Oregon wine unique? Well, I don't really know because I'm not a wine expert, but I do have a lot of data, and so I can figure it out in other ways. If you ask most people on the street, the way they're going to respond, Pinot Noir, right? This is what we do. And this is what we're known for in the Willamette Valley. But if you actually look at the data, I'm not sure we have actually that much evidence that this is the case. So the top 5 wine varieties on the West Coast are listed here. And so we've got Washington, Oregon, California. California has way more varieties of Pinot than we do. And, yes, we're known for our Pinot, but we actually don't have as much as California. Of course, part of that has to do with the fact that their wine growing region is massive. However, if we're known for Pinot, shouldn't we be getting high ratings for our Pinots? And the fact is, no, not really. Actually, wines at 98 points or higher on the West Coast, the only ones from Oregon are a Syrah. And none of our Pinots are actually kind of at that elite level of wine quality. And kind of to add insult to injury, the Syrahs that we do have that are rated highly are actually owned by a Washington winery. And the Washington winery produces Oregon Syrahs because they are located up in the Columbia Valley up near Walla Walla. and these particular Syrahs are just grown on the Oregon side of the Columbia, even though it's a Washington-owned vineyard. One ray of hope, of course, we do have a Ken Wright Pinot that scored 97. And so, perhaps there's a little bit of life for us in the winemaking world. Okay.
Before we move on, I'm sorry, we do have a question in the chat.
Sure.
Charlie is curious what the wine points mean and how they're measured.
There's a lot of controversy on this. This particular data set comes from Wine Spectator, which is a kind of world-renowned authority on wines, and they produce reviews of just about every single wine that exists in the world. And so these point ratings are point ratings that are given to a given year of vintage and label for a winery. And so you've got a particular wine. It is tasted by a sommelier, so an expert in wine, and then they rate it based on their subjective experience. So there are some biases in these. And so, for instance, Roger Voss hates Pinot Gris. And so you can actually see that pretty clearly in the data. Sarah has a few memories of that particular issue because it was on her midterm. I don't know if those are happy memories, Sarah, but they are memories nonetheless. But so there is some bias in the data, and there are ways of correcting for that, but that's perhaps beyond the scope of this particular presentation. Okay, so what really makes Oregon wines unique? So as Lizzie said, I do a lot of research on natural language processing, text analysis. And so the natural place for me to start in trying to answer a question like this is to look at the text that exists in the descriptions. And these descriptions are produced by the same professionals who are doing the wine tasting. And so they're giving me some, or they're giving some subjective explanation of what they're tasting. So it might be notes of cherry or chocolate, or perhaps earthy mushroom flavors. And so those sorts of descriptions are in the wine, along with a variety of other kind of text that accompanies those more specific words. And so I pull out text from the various descriptions, and then you can group this text according to whether it comes from, in this case, Oregon or California. And what you'll notice is that the words that exist furthest away from that dividing line, either above or below, are those words that are most descriptive or most distinguishing, right? The words that distinguish between a California and an Oregon wine. And so in this case, you see words like fruit and chocolate showing up a lot in the Oregon wines, but relatively less frequently in the California wines. Whereas you have silky aromas, acidity, cola showing up in the California Pinots, but not necessarily in the Oregon Pinots. You can also do a similar comparison to the other major Pinot producing region, which is Burgundy, France, to see how Oregon wines differ from that type of Pinot. And so here we've got structure and dense, concentrated aging. Those are the sorts of things that you would expect from a kind of old vineyard, a Grand Cru classified vineyard in French Burgundy. And versus Oregon here, where the main differences are in things like tart, earthy, herbal, and again, chocolate, cherry, and fruit. Okay, Any more questions, Lizzie?
Yes, Phyllis would like to know where you got the data. Is it from Willamette? Is it from an external source? Where is this from?
I grabbed the data straight off of Kaggle, which is a free kind of data science competition website. And so you can go and grab this data set if you'd like. In fact, I have some links at the end, which actually provide a GitHub link to this presentation, to the data, and to the Kaggle data set, which I'll show at the very end. I'm also happy to just answer your emails if you want me to point you in the right direction. But this is freely available. It was scraped off of the Wine Spectator website in 2017 or 18, something like that, is where the data comes from. Okay, any other questions?
What Donald would like to know, would it be more valuable to look at the sales volume of each variety of wine, letting the crowd choose rather than, I guess, the reviewers?
Of course, it depends on what he means by valuable, but it certainly could be, right? And, you know, whenever we're dealing with this sort of thing, we're always dealing within a set of limitations. And in this case, I am bound to the points, ratings, and descriptions that are given to me by the experts. I am beginning to do some work, however, on a craft beer database, which is consists of user reviews, which is much more crowdsourced. And if you come back for the third in our Happy Hour from Home series, my colleague Jake Hoskins will present some of the data from that data set, which we're really excited about. Any more?
I think we're good. Thank you.
Sure. One thought on that as well. These are basically retail prices, and so if you're an economist, you can kind of assume that the prices have been, you know, set efficiently. In other words, that some amount of, you know, consumer input has led to the prices that exist in this database.
And we do have one more before we move on. Sorry, Jameson.
Sure. Yeah, no,
Francis
please.
would like to know, how do we interpret this chart? Could you go over in a little more detail what this all means? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look on, for instance, the x-axis at the bottom, you can see a log scale of the frequency that a given word shows up if it's an Oregon wine. So the word fruit up here shows up about 10% of the time in Oregon wine, and about 8 or 9% of the time in Burgundy. Whereas a word like tart shows up, well, I can't quite interpolate on the log scale, but I would guess somewhere around 3% in the Oregon wine, but much less, like almost never in the Burgundy wine. And so the way to think about a graph like this is the further away that a given word is from the dividing line, the more it can be used to distinguish between the two regions. And so the word tart, being very far away from the dividing line, is a word that is good at distinguishing between Burgundy and Oregon Pinots. Can I move on?
I think so. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Good questions. Okay. So here's another way of looking at it, which kind of highlights, you know, the data in just a slightly different way. And so if you look at unique descriptors of the Pinot wine for Oregon versus California, you see fruit, chocolate, and berry, and tart being the words that show up most frequently in Oregon when compared to California. And then when comparing against Burgundy, you see words like cherry, fruit, and tart, and chocolate also as major distinguishers of the Oregon Pinots versus something that comes from France. So given that these flavors like cherry and chocolate are the most frequent, a natural next step is to ask, okay, well, how valuable are these flavors? Or in other words, how do the various raters actually think about these flavors when assigning a point score to a given wine? And so you can see here, if you have chocolate, it ends up largely being a flavor that exists in higher point wines versus a flavor like tart, which tends to be a lower rated wine. Although the hump in the data suggests that there are some wines that are both tart and highly rated. And so there may be something to explore there where you could look at the difference between, for instance, highly rated wines with the word tart and lower rated wines with the word tart to see if there's something else that might be unique in those data sets.
So Heather has a question about that.
Sure.
Do you have a way to describe the co-occurrence of these descriptors, and are these differences statistically significant?
Good question. You can try to see statistical significance by looking at the box plot, so I do have a measure of co-occurrence. Email me and we can talk about that later. It gets a little bit more complicated when you get into that kind of idea. In terms of statistical significance, hard to say. There is definitely statistical significance when I get into some of the regression models that I'm going to show you in a moment. But if we're just looking at data like this, it's kind of hard to say right off the bat. Okay. So another way of looking at it here, you can see the median values as the solid black lines. And so, you know, basically in the middle of the data set, you know, tart has lower points ratings, whereas chocolate and fruit tend to be higher, although fruit kind of bleeds into the lower point range more than the word chocolate does. If you then take a look at the words with the highest prices from Oregon Pinots, and again, we're kind of assuming here that prices are somewhat set efficiently. I don't have demand data in this data set, and so there's no way of kind of doing you know, a full structural model here, but we can, with that assumption, start to look at things like you know, the influence of a particular flavor on the pricing power that a particular wine has. And so here we're seeing things like the word dense, and savory, and currant, and clove, leading to higher prices, and generally, on average, higher point ratings as well. Okay, so what if we look at, so I should pause. Lizzie, any more questions?
Do we have more questions?
Okay.
I think you're good to move on.
All right, thank you so much. So let's take a look a little bit beyond just the descriptions. And if we look at instead just variation in points by province, you'll notice something that's also a little bit unique, which is that Oregon tends to have a slightly tighter distribution around points. And so yes, I was a little disappointed early on to see that both California and Burgundy have higher rated Pinots. However, it does seem like Oregon's Pinots are a bit more consistent. And so perhaps you don't see the highest highs, but you also don't see the lowest lows in the Oregon Pinots either. This is another way of looking at very similar data, right, where you see both in California bleeding into the high point range and the low point range, but the Oregon wines are concentrated a bit more in the middle of the rating scale. Another way of looking at this is points per dollar. And so if you think about points, and if you believe that points are an accurate version of quality, you can start asking a question like, okay, well, what's the most bang for your buck? And not surprisingly, Burgundy is the lowest bang for your buck. And the reason is largely because, Burgundy wines are really expensive. And I think part of that is just the fact that, they come with a history, they have status in the wine industry. And so even wines that are rated somewhat lower, if they come from that region of France, they get to command a slightly higher price. Similarly for California, the prices are a bit higher for the points. And so there is some encouraging evidence here which suggests that if you are buying Oregon Pinots, you are getting the most bang for your buck. In other words, the points, the average points that you get for dollar spent is higher on an Oregon Pinot than it is on these other two Pinot producing regions. Kind of further encouraging news, if you look at the trajectory of both California and Oregon Pinots over time, they started quite a bit lower. And so our wine growers have been learning something over time, whereas the Burgundy wines have been high for a long time in terms of their quality ratings. Oregon and California, except for one really bad year in 2001 for Oregon, have been growing in their quality over time. Recently, however, Oregon's quality has stagnated a bit, while California's point ratings have continued to climb and eventually even matched those of Burgundy, France. Okay, now things get a little bit interesting. Sorry, Lizzie, was there a question that came in?
There was. Charlie would like to know, can the tight distribution be solely attributed to number of varieties, or is there a way to prove that Oregon produces more consistent quality wine?
Right. So you would expect, right, to have greater variation if there's just more, right, of a given wine. However, I've looked at that particular issue, and even if you do kind of some samples, you can see a tighter distribution. And I'm not, honestly, it's possible that some of it has to do with the amount of variety. However, right, if you compare it to the number of wines that France has, it's actually not that much different. And so I'm not sure, I should say I'm not entirely sure that you can explain the variance entirely with variety. Although that would be something that you would want to look into more deeply. Good question, man. This is a well-educated group. I like this. Yeah, one more?
Yes. First of all, Heather says confidence intervals as a response to that question.
There you go. Thank you, Heather.
And then Phyllis asks, have you applied some computation models when running data science?
So there are a variety of models that you can run on this data and that we have run on this data. I have removed several of them from this presentation, but you can do a variety of things. My students during the semester did things ranging from topic models on the textual data, to naive Bayes estimations of various wine types and locations, and other both unsupervised and supervised machine learning models to try to understand, for instance, the relationship between points rating and price. So there were quite a few different computational methods that were applied to the data. We even went in and used a bit of TensorFlow to see if we could create some neural nets on this data as well. What I'm showing you now is a fairly simple computational model, and which is essentially linear regression, one of the simplest, right? And the interesting thing about this particular model is that it can show you the relationship between points and price, and therefore some notion of the pricing power that a given region has. And so here, it looks to me, right, like that Burgundy definitely has more pricing power with quality, but if I'm just eyeballing it, Oregon, the slope on the Oregon regression line is perhaps a bit steeper than that of California, which might suggest that we've got a bit more pricing power here as well. And indeed, if you look at the actual estimates from this kind of regression, you do find that to be the case, that a 1-point ratings increase leads to about a 22.5% increase in price for the Burgundy wines, and substantially less for the California wines, and we are doing a bit better. So in other words, if we get a 1-point increase, right, a 1-point increase in our rating for a given wine, the result is a much greater increase in price for that wine. And so there is a bit more pricing power for the Oregon wines than for California, which I think is actually encouraging and may suggest that even though we don't have the highest rated wines in Oregon, the brand of Oregon Pinot is such that our status is higher than California. And you would expect that for a higher status region, this sort of relationship to hold, where you have a higher pricing power for increases in quality. You can also look at this sort of relationship related to actual words. And so this gets into an area which I'm actually kind of excited about, because it leads directly to managerial insights for Oregon wineries, right? This is the sort of thing that California has been doing for a long time on its Cabernets, which is, let's analyze what the experts want, right? And then let's design our wines to give it to them. And they've been very successful in that strategy over time. And so by identifying which flavors actually lead to the highest changes in price, you can start to kind of narrow down the flavor profile that the experts are looking for in an Oregon Pinot, and then potentially start to design your wines towards that flavor profile. And so here you can see, the word fruit, has a little bit less of a change in price versus chocolate, which seems to be valued. by the marketplace. And then, of course, tart is less valued by the marketplace. You can also actually distill this down by type of berry. So not just fruit, but if we look at the specific berries that show up within the descriptions, it looks like blackberry and cherry are the most valued, whereas strawberry is about at the average for Oregon Pinots. Okay, so in summary, Oregon Pinots, they're fruit forward, hints of chocolate and berries, generally a lower overall variance in quality, but has been rising in quality over time. Good news, we've got a bit more pricing power than California, and we are definitely the most bang for your buck. So if you were to take something like this and sell it to the Wine Growers Association or something along those lines, you'd want to say, look, we need to continue to work to retain the status of the Willamette Valley wines, because it is that status which gives us the pricing power, right? And so it prevents us from losing too much when quality goes down, but it really helps us if we produce higher quality wines to capture some of that value. And it's also encouraging for smaller wineries who don't necessarily have massive brand name recognition, because they can use insights about the flavor profiles to actually figure out, okay, how do I break in? How do I compete with the big guys if I want the experts and the industry to recognize my particular wine? Okay, so any more questions, Lizzie?
Not so far. Feel free to send them in, folks.
Yeah, no problem. And then I did want to leave you with a couple of things. First of all, we are way better than Texas. And so I think we should all feel really good about that. And second of all, here's what the data says on the best bang for your buck. So Oregon Pinot's under 50. Now, some of these, they got smart. And so these are the prices for the bottles when they first came out. And so you may, if you go and try to find them on Vivino or some other, purchasing app, maybe a bit higher price now because people figured out how good they are. But this is what the data says is the best bang for your buck. Sinian 2015 Pinot Noir from Willamette Valley. And so with that, I will send out, or Lizzie, I'll send you a PDF and you can send out a document with all of this stuff. But if you have, additional questions, also feel free to just email me directly. Here's a whole bunch of links that you can use. This is some of the stuff that I used in preparing this presentation. The cool thing about working with the Tidyverse and some of this stuff in our studio is you can produce an entire presentation like the one you just saw directly from our studio. All of the scripts that you need to actually reproduce every single analysis are embedded in the file. And so if you go to my GitHub account, you can actually download the entire script that produces presentation, all of the analyses, reproduce everything from scratch on your own, if that's something that interests you. And so with that, I will pause and take any questions that you have, either about the presentation or the program. And feel free to send them in the chat or raise your hand. Cheers to those of you who are going to sign off. Thank you so much for attending. It was lovely to have you. I am here and I will stick around for at least 10 or 15 minutes if folks want to chat.
We do have some more questions in the chat. Let me see. So Charlie says, how manageable was the data that you used?
I would say that relatively manageable. I think that we were dealing with, tens of thousands of rows of data, and so it wasn't quite in the millions. So it's still at the size where you can run most models on a laptop. And there were certain models, like some of our decision tree models that we were running, that especially if you're running a random forest model, your computer would start smoking. But for the most part, you can still use a data set of this size on a laptop. Of course, if it gets much bigger than that, you should probably jump onto our Willamette server, and we've got our studio server that you can log into and run your models on a 32 core massive computer over at Hatfield Library. So I would say relatively manageable. And so you can do descriptive statistics like we saw here pretty quickly, and run most models, within minutes, sometimes 30 or 40 minutes if it's a complicated model.
Melody says, are all the price endpoints from Wine Spectator, and how many years and wines were in the database?
So I cut off the dates a little bit because the data before 1990 was pretty sparse. And then the data after 2015 was also sparse because the raters hadn't had a chance to go out and sample everything yet. And so the data that I used for this presentation was, I think, so like 1990 or so through 2015. Did I answer everything?
Melody would also like to know, can we have the article of the study? You could just send that to me and I'll pass it along to everybody.
Yeah, so I haven't written a paper on this. I've just been playing around with it. But it would be fun to write a paper on this, I think. Maybe published in the Journal of Wine Economics.
And then May says, how many models did you do before coming to such findings? Is the data straightforward? Or does it require a lot of transformation and cleaning?
Yeah, it does require a fair bit of transformation and cleaning, and especially when you're dealing with text data, there's a bunch of stuff that you have to deal with. It's something that I do on a regular basis, and some of the newer text mining libraries are really helpful in that regard. So rule of thumb, you spend about 85% of your time wrangling the data, and about 10 or 15% of your time actually modeling it. That's just the life of a data scientist.
And then follow-up question. Maybe I'm not understanding this, May, but the question exactly is, did the mean the library text mining in Python?
So the text mining library that I used for this is Tidy Text Mining, which is in R package written by Julia Silge, which is a great package. It actually just came out about 6 months ago. I do work in both R and Python. I used to do all of my natural language processing work exclusively in Python, but R has come a long way in the last 9 or 10 months, and so I've started to move that direction as kind of the support packages have become available. Anything else? Those are great questions. If anyone has questions about the program or data science in general, I'm happy to stick around and answer those. If not, thank you again. Thank you so much for showing up. This was a blast. I love presenting this data. It's a lot of fun to work with, and you have all been a lovely audience. Um, um, looks like there's more chat. Lizzie, I'll let you read that. Let me know if I need to respond. But otherwise, maybe we should call it quits and, you know, promise to say hi again in the future.
Donald's just commenting on the value of analyzing sales volume.
Indeed, and that would be nice data to have in this case, no doubt, because it would give us some indication of demand as well, right? And so with all due hand waving, right, we have to assume that prices are set efficiently in this situation. Yeah.
And then Francis is asking the question that I think all of us are wondering, which is, by any chance, have you found out what is the best year for Oregon Pinot?
Oh gosh, good question. It really depends, but 2014 and 2015 seem to have some really, really good wines. And so check those out. I know that 2014 Willamette Valley Vineyards has a great one, but I should, actually, Sarah, do you remember, wasn't that an assignment that I gave you all at one point?
Yeah, it was. I'm actually just pulling up my R studio, like my RMDs, to try and find the answer. I'll let you know if I find it.
Right, I can't remember. Okay, so make sure to show back up for the next two happy hour from home presentations. Lizzie, I think the next one is what, in a week?
Yes, next Thursday and then the Thursday after that. Same time, same everything.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for hosting, Lizzie. I appreciate it. Thank you all for attending. That was lovely. I'm gonna go pour myself a glass of Oregon Pinot. Cheers.
Cheers. There is one more.
Go ahead. Is it something I can answer?
I think so. Yes. If you're happy to answer one more, Cindy would like to know. I don't know. Cindy's not here anymore. Oh, Cindy is still here. Hi, Cindy. To what extent is the Oregon data representative of the Willamette Valley?
It is every single wine in the Willamette Valley. So as far as I can tell, it is pretty complete. Now we've had a bunch of kind of boutique vineyards, you know, showing up in the last few years, and so some of that may not be represented since I cut it off at 2015. But it's pretty comprehensive.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us, Jameson. This was awesome. I feel like I learned a lot. I hope everyone else feels the same. I'm excited to see you all next week.
Thanks, Lizzie.